My name is John Weingart. I'm Associate Director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics, and I'm delighted to welcome you here for this talk. We have a number of programs throughout the year. This is, I guess, the final program in this academic year. Thank you all for coming. We're broadcasting this, if that's the right word, streaming it live on Facebook. So there's an unseen audience out there who we welcome as well. If you have a cell phone, please turn it off. If you don't have one, I'd recommend them. They're useful for lots of things. This program is presented as part of the Eagleton program on immigration and democracy, which explores the challenges and opportunities stemming from the significant levels of immigration across the state, the region, the nation, and the world, historically and at the present time. The name Immigration and Democracy as the initiative reflects the close intertwining of immigration and democracy as central themes in the American experience and in the Eagleton Institute of Politics' specific interest in it. Our speaker, Sayu Bhojwani, is the founder and president of New American Leaders, which works across the country to increase the power and potential of first and second generation Americans. She received a PhD in politics and education from Columbia University. She, earlier in her career, was appointed by Mayor Michael Bloomberg as New York City's first Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs, a post she filled from 2002 till 2004, I think. And she was recently named by Roll Call magazine as one of the 3 people to watch in 2019, so you'll be able to do that in just a minute. Someone who is working to give immigrant communities greater representation in the public sphere. And finally, we're proud to say that she is a visiting scholar here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. She's here today to discuss her new book. The book is for sale in the lobby, and you can buy it at any point during the presentation or right after, and afterwards she'll be willing to sign books. The book is called People Like Us, The New Wave of Candidates Knocking at Democracy's Door. And it's my pleasure to welcome Sayu Bhojwani.
Thank you, John. Thank you all. Again, I want to echo John's thanks for choosing this room over the beautiful weather outside. Do I need to do something to this, Ben? Oh, there we go. Okay. So I want to just commend you all because I speak all over the country and the first row is always empty. So I think now I have a tip that we should have couches because then no one will sit so far away from me that I feel like maybe they're afraid I'll bite. So it's an exciting time to be talking about democracy. I've always found it kind of exciting to talk about democracy, but more people are interested. So it's great to see that there are other political nerds that are, once again, choosing this room over many other options. I want to start with the question of asking you a question of how many of you trust your government leaders? Show of hands. Generally, do you trust your government leaders? A sprinkling of people. I think I stand among those that after time in the United States, started to feel like I didn't trust my government leaders to make the right decisions for our communities, which is why I started New American Leaders, which John mentioned I now run. And the organization, which I will spend very little time on, but I just want to ground my remarks in the work that I do, which is focused on training first and second generation Americans to run for office. Now, that might seem to you like a really exciting and timely thing to do. However, 8 or 9 years ago when I started it, people were not as excited as they are now about changing representation. So I like to say that I was interested in local politics before it was fashionable, for better or worse, because it was a long journey to ensure that the organization survived. And I'm happy to report that we're thriving. It's the one thing that I can, I have to say this very carefully, it's one of the few benefits that came out of the 2016 election results. I want to say that actually in this room, there's actually more people who, relative to the American public, trust government, because Pew reported in 2017 that only 18% of American people today trust government to make the decisions that are right for the community. And that, as you all probably know, is a percentage that has been steadily decreasing, but is at an all-time low. And there's really no reason why we would, because when we look at government, we don't see ourselves. And whether that's ourselves as people of color, whether that's ourselves as immigrants, whether that's ourselves as women, whether that's ourselves as people who were first-generation college students or working class, there really is there are very few leaders who look like us, who reflect our experiences. Even with the progress that was made in the 2018 elections, Congress is still 73% white and 76% male. I want to talk a little bit today about why that is, how we got there, and then what we can do about it together or individually in order to change that. When our founding fathers began the project that is America, and I do think of it as a project, a work in progress, one that we all have to contribute to making better, we were a scrappy young nation. They basically created government in their image. They created a government that would work for them. They created a government that made sense for a bunch of guys who owned plantations and businesses and didn't trust the rest of the American public to make decisions that reflected their interests. And so they were basically self-appointing themselves as leaders to make decisions on behalf of the people. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means, what the kind of government that they created means for today's America in a moment. They definitely were not thinking that they needed to establish a government that would work for everyone. They believed that they were in the best position to make decisions. They also thought that it made sense to create state governments, for example, that would meet only for a few days of the year. Usually every time I do this talk, I think I should look this up and then I forget. What is the season that is not the harvest season? Yes, winter, planting season, whatever. So, it made a lot of sense for the Georgia State Legislature to set a calendar that will meet 40 days a year at the beginning of the year. It made a lot of sense for that to happen in Montana, for example, where even today, most of the people on the Montana State Legislature are farmers or lawyers, because it's a schedule that made a lot of sense at a certain time in America, just like our school schedule made a lot of sense at a certain time in America. But today we have a government that is far more professionalized, that has staff, that has full-time responsibilities, including, we don't like to necessarily think about this, but there are lobbyists. There's a whole culture of government that is much more robust, that is more professionalized, and that has its pros and cons, but that is the reality of modern-day American government. And so this system that was supposed to work for wealthy white men doesn't work for the America of today, and it certainly won't work for the America of tomorrow. While only 62% of the country is white, and even in that group, there are people who are classified as white or choose white as a census category, for example, who are Arab American. And so we have an incredibly diverse country that includes 38% or more people of color, immigrants, Jewish Americans, women, et cetera, who do not have a voice in our government. I'm going to go through the statistic just for those of you who may not be familiar, but 13% of our country is African American, 6% Asian American, 18% Latino, 13% foreign born, and 51% female. Although America is more diverse than ever before, our leaders still look like they walked off the Mayflower, even though this slide, this incredible new cohort of women, this is mostly what Congress still looks like. And then Asian Pacific Islanders and Latinos are only 5% of state legislators of color. And and I think I have another slide that shows that Asian Pacific Islanders and Latinos combined are only 2%. They only hold 2% of all of the 500,000 state and local elected office around the country. So that's everything from county commissioner to dog catcher. I want to spend most of my time talking about what are the conditions that got us here and what are some of the things that we need to change in order for this number and this percentage to grow exponentially rather than incrementally. We saw these incredible wins in 2018 and some in 2016 as well that were kind of lost in the national coverage. But in order for us to see huge numbers of new folks coming into office, and that's not just first and second generation Americans, but in order for the dynamics of representation to change, we really need to make systemic changes. But I want to start first by talking about the main challenges that face political newcomers that tend to be psychological, right? And I'm going to go through some of those very quickly. First of all, we don't see ourselves in leadership. So there is, every morning I wake up and some new, usually older white guy has decided that they're going to run for president, whereas that is, I can't even get the women in our program to think about running for school board, right, which is something that's very close to them, that doesn't require as much of a time commitment, but we seem to think that we need even more people running for president every day, and that Michael Bennet, state senator in Colorado, today jumped into the race. I'm not even sure what his main platform is, but it doesn't seem to matter. And for people like us, we don't see our voices represented. And so instead of thinking we should be there, we think, oh, well, someone like me can't be in office. And that's a very real thing. I mean, it's the reason why I call the book People Like Us, because I wanted to really name that people like us is a big tent, right? It's not just the first and second generation American population that I work with. And when I talk about the systemic issues, you'll see that many of them apply to all of us in the room, whether we're first or second generation American or not. But for first and second generation Americans, we're also faced with the kinds of things that we hear in the national coverage about our leaders and in media, that we're animals, that we're drug dealers, our children are not worthy of care, and they are so worthless that they are being put in cages. People like me have our brothers and our uncles, our friends being taken off planes, being arrested for no reason, being questioned for no reason. Our children are bullied in schools. And so all of this, the cumulative impact of all of this is to make us feel like we are not worthy, that we are not qualified, that we are not accepted, and that not only are we not fully qualified to be leaders, but that we're barely fully American, right? And so if you're carrying that trauma, that burden of unbelonging with you, it's very hard to imagine how you're going to step into a position of power. And then there are these very real systemic issues that folks are facing. I wrote the book, and maybe I should have started there. I wrote the book because, I had a lot of free time running a nonprofit organization training immigrants to run for office. And it wasn't like every day there wasn't another news story that was depressing me. But I wrote the book because I actually think that there are so many stories of hope among people like me who could just give up. Actually are really willing to fight for this American project and for this American dream. And what happened in 2016, and everybody whose story I tell in this book got elected in 2016 or before that. And so I really wanted to mark that. I wanted to mark that there was something that happened in the 2016 election that was, gut-wrenching for many of us. But lost in all of that were these incredible stories of people who were formerly undocumented, people who are American Muslims, people who were told by the Democratic Party that there's no way that the community they were running in would vote for them. And all of those people won. Sometimes they defeated Democratic incumbents. Sometimes they unseated Republicans. Sometimes they ran and against, in one case, I tell the story of someone who ran against a candidate that was backed by the Disney Corporation. The candidate who won raised about $45,000 in 2016. His opponent got over $1 million in both direct and indirect support. And so there were these incredible stories, and my hope was that in documenting those stories, I could provide some energy to folks who were thinking about running, but also, and most importantly, I wanted to shed light on the systemic issues and the fact that, like I said, in order for us to see change, we're going to need to change the way that the system works. And some of those systemic things, again, you may be familiar with, and I want to talk briefly about them and then share with you 3 stories from the book to give you a sense of what I wanted to share with you all. So one thing we know is that incumbents don't want to vacate their seats. That's a problem that I'm sure you see in New Jersey, if not, in the stories that you read around the country. And then there's this very fundamental problem where party leaders want to endorse others who look like them, and that there is this look like me, is like me, familiar to me. And I think that is a fundamental reason why the coverage that you're seeing about the Democratic frontrunners tends to be about other white men, because we are used to seeing white men in the presidency. We're used to seeing men in the presidency. And so there is a tendency to dismiss someone that seems unfamiliar, that you're unsure whether they're going to be able to win the votes. You want to support someone who looks like you. And that, I think that's works in both ways, right? It works for someone like me. When I see a woman of color on the ballot, I'm interested in learning more about that person. And it works for other people in different ways. So I want to underline that like me syndrome is a very human and natural thing, but that until we are willing to test some new models, then we're going to continue to elect the same types of folks. There's also the fact that I've already touched on, that money plays a big role in politics. But money plays a big role in politics not just in terms of campaigns, because we hear a lot about that, right? We hear a lot about how costly campaigns are and how much you have to raise, but also because public life was not really designed to become a kind of professional pursuit, right? Like I talked about what our founding fathers set up. Many of them were, in fact, suspicious of the idea that people would choose public life as a career. And so this idea of citizen legislatures, which at some point, and maybe in some states, continues to make sense, certainly does not make sense in places like New Jersey and New York, where there is an expectation by the general public that their legislators are always going to be working, that our legislators are always going to be working on our behalf. And so what you see, and I'll talk a little bit more about this when I share the first story, but basically you have, I forget what the salary is. Do you know, does anyone know what the salary is in New Jersey for the state legislature? Because you have a hybrid, right? It meets throughout the year, and people have, I think you have full-time staff here for New Jersey legislature. 40,000. So in Arizona, it's 24,000. In Colorado, it's 30,000. In Georgia, it's 18,000. And I mentioned those 3 states because in those 3 states, the salary has not been raised for over 20 years. So not only is it super low, it also hasn't gotten a cost of living increase and not been adjusted for inflation. So we, for example, at New American Leaders have a staff member who's a Georgia state legislator. I found out when we were interviewing for the job that when we were interviewing her for the job, I knew the salary, but she said to me, well, I can't tell you when I can start working because when I report to the state legislature on the second Monday of every January, that's when we get told some of what our schedule is going to be. So I just want you to think about what it means if you are thinking about running for office and you have no idea what your schedule is going to be. What kind of job could you hold down while you're also a state legislator? And what we find is that basically it's no coincidence that the people who you see in office tend to be business people and lawyers. And that's partly, especially lawyers in private practice, and that's partly because it's something that they can manage. And so when I say business people, for some of you, maybe that's a really, really bad thing, but it can also be a small business owner. It can be someone who's an owner-operator of a business. But there's an ability to manage running the business and taking the time off to be in the state legislature. So to me, this is one of the worst kept secrets of public life, that we don't know how poorly we're paying our state legislatures, and we know that the states are the essential laboratory for fighting back against the federal government around all sorts of policies that ensure our day-to-day well-being, our access to education, our access to health care, our access to our bodies, frankly. All of these things, our access to the ballot box, are being controlled by state legislatures. So if your state legislators don't understand what the experience of paying for affordable college education is, if they don't understand what it means to have a sick parent and need to find healthcare support for them, if they don't understand those experiences because they don't have them, then it makes it very difficult for them to create policy that works for people around the state. So that was a little bit of a tangent on the whole issue of money, because for the last few years, what I've learned in rooms that talk about money in politics, that the conversation is all about, we don't want candidates to accept corporate PAC money, the cost of campaigns is too high, and the fact is that I could manage to have a publicly financed campaign and get into office and still not be able to make ends meet. We have an alum, this is the last story that I'm going to share about this. We have an alum in New York who got elected. She was a housing advocate, an attorney by training. And she got elected to the New York State Assembly. She's actually the first Dreamer, Catalina Cruz, the first Dreamer to be, a former Dreamer, to be elected to the State Assembly. And she took a pay cut. She's now earning half the salary that she was earning as a housing attorney. And that was a choice that she was both able to make and could and wanted to make, but not everybody can make that choice, right? And so I'm deeply, deeply concerned about how do we ensure that we're creating more professionalized opportunities for people like me to serve in office and to be the champions of the kind of policy that we want to see. But I'm going to come back to my outline here now and tell you 3 stories from the book. And the first one does start with money, and it talks more about, so in this book, I have chapter 4 is a story of someone who struggled with this issue of what it meant once he got into office. But the other chapters do talk about the cost of money and running for office. And in one, I tell the story of Athina Salman, who is a state rep in Arizona. For District 26. Athina is the daughter of an immigrant father from Palestine and a mother who is part Latina and part European. She was in the 7th grade during September 11th, and then right after that, her entire family, except for her mother, were placed on the watch list. So the mother's last name is different than the father and Athina and her brothers, who all have the last name Salman. So every time that they traveled, some of you know the drill. Every time she traveled with her family, they would go through this questioning process. And so that was her experience as a young person. And she went on to college. She became a student organizer after the Arizona State Legislature cut tuition funding, increasing tuition at Arizona State University, where she was a student. And she was the first in her family to go to college and knew that her brothers were about to follow, and so was very concerned about whether her family would be able to continue to pay college tuition for everyone. And then she graduated. When she graduated, she was greeted with the 2008 recession. And so she and her classmates, all of whom were college graduates, took the jobs that were available. And so her first full-time job was at the Westin Hotel, where she became a union member of Unite Here, and then a union shop steward. So part of the story of Athina's journey is the multiple points at which she's affected by what is. So it's not just that she is the daughter of an immigrant father, but that she experiences racially motivated harassment, that she experiences the challenges of funding an affordable college education, that she experiences the challenges of finding a job, that she grows up both in an immigrant family and in the organizing movement in college and as a union steward. And so when she ran for office in 2016, she brought all of those experiences to her work. But she ran for office in a state that had what is called a clean elections law, which is a form of public financing. In that program, because she participated in that program, she didn't have to worry about raising thousands of dollars to run for office. Basically, the way the program works is that it varies. The idea of public financing, the programs around public financing vary depending on where you are. But in Arizona, you are supposed to raise $4,000 initially. So the expectation is that you're going to raise that $4,000 from voters in your district. And then you receive $16,000 to $45,000, depending on how competitive the election is. Don't quote me on those numbers because they change every year. And that $4,000, when you're raising those initial $4,000, it's an opportunity to connect to voters. But once you've raised that, the rest of your time is spent doing just that, connecting to voters, talking to them about the issues, not having to worry about raising money, using the dollars provided by the state to do the work that needs to be done on the campaign trail, to hire staffers, print flyers, et cetera. In 2018, she ran for re-election because we also have this crazy thing where you have to run every 2 years in the state, in most states. And now she's a minority whip in the Arizona House. So she has a very exciting journey, and she's super committed to public financing, which is constantly under threat in the Arizona state legislature because they want to get rid of the program so that, quote unquote, organizers stop running for office. And what is happening increasingly in Arizona is that because of Citizens United and the ability of, so how many of you are familiar with Citizens United? Great, so I can shortcut through that. But essentially the challenge is not just the individual candidate, right? The challenge is all the money that comes in outside of the individual candidate's campaign. And so you're having situations where people are making the tough decision that if they run clean, which is the short version of accepting the public financing participating in the public financing program, is that then they're faced with candidates who are not running clean and who have the ability to spend a lot more money. And so still many people, certainly the folks we are training, many of them are taking the clean route. But increasingly, people are finding it hard to compete. So, you have this great program, and it's helped elect a lot of folks, but there is this constant tension around that, and how do we preserve it, and what does it mean, the threat that it presents to other members of the House about the types of voices that are going to come into the state legislature. But fundamentally, we're seeing public financing programs. Actually, yesterday, lost among your Twitter feed or whatever, wherever you're getting the news, is that Kristen Gillibrand, one of the 20 and plus candidates running for office, introduced I guess shared a policy around this idea of democracy dollars, where people would get, I think she said $600 to support campaigns. So it's the first kind of national candidate that I've heard talking about the issue of public financing. I don't think $600 is going to change the way that public financing works, but I think what's important is that the conversation is being had, right? Like, how do we take money out of politics? But I'm going to just come back to remind you that when you hear people talk about that, to remember that it's not just taking the money out of politics, but also bringing salaries up to par so that we can have people like you serving. The second story I want to share with you is about Raquel Casaneda Lopez. And she is a city council member in Detroit. And I told her story in the context of a conversation about what are called single-member districts. So I don't know. I know you guys are all from all parts of New Jersey, and New Jersey is like its own country with all the different counties and towns. But let's take New Brunswick. Does New Brunswick have a city council? I guess it must have a city council, right? Do you know if it's at large or single member? Anybody? It is at large. So what that means is that in order for someone to run, you have to be able to get votes from all around the city, right? Or at minimum, you have to get enough support to win the entire city election, right? Whereas in a district election, you just have to win support from a section of the city. Raquel is a third-generation Mexican-American. She was born in Michigan. She still lives in the house that she grew up in. And before she ran for office, she had worked on campaigns and taught at when she actually worked on Rashida Tlaib's first run for state house in Michigan. But she herself had not thought about running for office. And then in 2012, Detroit went from citywide elections to district elections. And this has, I think you'll see this sort of, there was a trend right after the 2010 census, and more of that will happen after the 2020 census. I had a moment where I forgot what year I was in. And what happens basically is that there's a number of different ways that this plays out. And in the book, I talk about the different ways that it plays out. In the case of Detroit, it was really kind of a citizen and nonprofit-led initiative to take the Detroit City Council and divide it up into single-member districts. And naturally, anybody who is sitting on the city council objects to that because, again, they know the formula. That's how they've gotten their seats there. They don't like the idea of anything changing. In other places, like in Yakima, which I also tell the story of a Yakima city council member who got elected. In Yakima, the ACLU filed a lawsuit against the city because the city was over 50% Latino and had no Latinos on the city council. And so they argued that it was in violation of the Voting Rights Act because it was not giving a voice to Latinos. In Raquel's case, she was convinced once the decision was made and the maps were drawn, her local community members convinced her to run and encouraged her that by saying that they would sign up and volunteer for her campaign. Her district, the district that was drawn and that she now represents, is 39% Latinx and 39% African American, and then the remaining 22% are Arab Americans, Caucasians, and Asian Americans. And when she got elected, that was in 2013, she became the first and is still now the only Latina on the city council. In fact, since the 1970s, all but 2 Detroit City Council members have been African American. So the issue of representation and having a voice on the council has been it's a challenge across community, right? This is not just about a white and other. It's also about who are we seeing representing our communities. And although it's funny because Raquel's district is not predominantly Arab American, but because she is someone that they identify with closely because of her Mexican-American background, she gets a lot of Arab American constituents from Dearborn and the like calling the office, asking for support. This is the like me thing, right? Like I see someone who I think is similar to me in some way and I want to make a connection to them. The fact is, though, that there's no way, maybe now I tease her that she could run for mayor because she is a name, but there's no way in 2012 that she would have been able to run a citywide election as successfully as she did her district election, because this is a community in which she had grown up. This is a community in which she played soccer, in which she had students, in which her family lived. And so that shift, in terms of our systemic shift from a citywide election to a district member election is really an important way to get new voices in. And the story about Yakima that I tell in the book, in fact, Carmen was elected in a district that is 90% white. So it's the same rule applies, right? It's not just that the district looks like her, but that this is a district in which she was a known entity, and she didn't have to raise money for a campaign that could be competitive in a citywide election. How am I doing on time? I'm not timing myself, so am I okay? Okay. So I have one more story to tell you about someone you all probably know very well or have at least heard of, which is Ilhan Omar. Now, of course, she's a national figure, but in 2016, she was much less known. And when I interviewed her for the book, it was right after she had won her first race for office, and that was the race for the Minnesota State Legislature. It was a highly contested race. She, as you know, probably, I think most of you probably have heard about Ilhan Omar for better or worse now. She was born in Somalia. She came to Minneapolis at the age of 14 after living in a refugee camp. She's black, Muslim, female. So much of what is under attack today and so much of what is under attack right in this moment as we speak. At that time, she had been active in local politics, but when she decided to run, she was running against a 44-year incumbent. This is someone who was born even before, who was elected even before Ilhan was born. In Minnesota, they have this process at the Democratic Farmer Labor Party convention where the delegates have to vote for the people on the ballot. And if you get a certain number, if you get 60% of support from the delegates, then you don't actually have to go on to the primary election. I tell you in much more detail in my book about how she ended up not being able to secure that 60%, but then went on to win the election in August of 2016. And this made national news because she had defeated a 44-year incumbent. I think at that time, none of us knew what a force she was, but there was indications of that. Now, I tell you the story of Ilhan in part because it's a dramatic story of someone who was well positioned after that 2016 election to run for Congress. I think it would have been a lot harder for her to win this congressional seat if she hadn't already been on the state legislature. She won the primary in August of 2016 with 41% of the vote, and then immediately thereafter became, a real poster child for, and particularly after Trump got elected, because so much of who she is and what she speaks for and about runs counter to the conversation that we were hearing from the Trump administration. What she did during that period of time that in her first race is talk to voters who had never been talked to before. She also engaged young college students, which those of you who are, maybe if you're commuters, it's not the same, but if you are residents on college campuses, you understand that it's not that easy to participate. I mean, I don't know, I assume that some of you are college students. I'm totally profiling now. But if you're in college out of state, it's much harder to participate. But the Omar campaign in 2016 took nothing for granted, and there's actually a great film called Time for Ilhan that I think is available on Amazon Prime now, that tells the story of that 2016 campaign. And effectively, she built a foundation that no one at the time knew would then be leveraged for a 2018 congressional run. But in the chapter about her in the book, I talk about the importance of term limits. Now, people have very conflicting feelings about term limits. They get really annoyed with me when I start talking about term limits. But I think there are terms and there are terms. There are 6-year terms, and there's 12-year terms, and then there's no terms at all. And I think something between 12 to 18, maybe 2024 for the Supreme Court. I think that there is a moment at which people need to exit stage left so that others can come in, or maybe exit stage right, and then where you create an opportunity for someone who not only looks like the district, is more connected to the issues of the moment, and frankly has not established the kind of loyalties that do get established after you've been there for a really long time. That I do think that even the most human of us make more subjective decisions when we're dealing with people with whom we've developed long relationships, or people who are family members for that matter, right? But it's an extension of that concept. And so I think you bring in new voices, in part because they bring new perspectives, in part because they have the opportunity to develop conversations and relationships that are free of these long-term loyalties and strings attached. And I think that's a value to our government, right? It also, as we know with Ilhan and as we know with any of the women who got elected this year, that it inspires hundreds of other people to feel like they have a voice. And whether they run for Congress or for state legislature or for governor is kind of irrelevant. It just gives them a sense that people like me can do things as well, right? And so I talk about term limits very intentionally, knowing that it is something that drives people kind of crazy. But I feel like if you get the right balance of years, you can benefit from people's having some seniority and experience. And then if we address all of these things at the same time or sequentially, you imagine a scenario in which you have term limits, you imagine a scenario in which people are being paid wage that can allow them to make a living and dedicate their time to service. And you imagine a scenario in which they are getting staff that is being paid full-time. So then all of a sudden, you have a robust professional system that is open to everyone, that is not reliant on lobbyists. Because one of the arguments that I hear is that, well, if you have term limits, then it's the lobbyists that make all the decisions. But part of the reason for that is that the legislature doesn't have enough funding or doesn't allocate enough funding to ensure that legislators have full-time staff, right? Because the staff can also be responsible for guiding policy decisions. I mean, a lot of this amazing stuff that you're seeing in hearings, in congressional hearings, a lot of those statements and at least the initial prep work is being done by qualified staff. So in my vision for an American government, I see one that is much more modernized and that reflects the needs of our population today. It reflects the needs of, like, when you go to the supermarket and you see your state legislator, you're not thinking, oh, this is not the 40 days that they're getting paid for. You're thinking you're going to tell them what's on your mind, right? And so it really is a full-time job, whether we want to admit it or not. I'm going to close by saying that these women and the stories that I tell in the book, and really anyone who is a person of color or immigrant who decides to run for office, is sharing, frankly, the same struggles as all of us are, right? That we want a secure life, we want opportunities for ourselves and our families. I think what makes women and immigrants different, in immigrants in particular, which is kind of the population I work with, is that we have continuously fought to be here, that there's no assumption of privilege or power, and that when we come here, whether it's the journey to get here, whether it's the journey to stay here, whether it's the journey to take our place at the table, we're constantly fighting. And so that, to me, is one of the, if you want to call it a qualification or a characteristic that makes us some of the most optimistic Americans and potentially some of the best public servants that this country can have, that we can bring that level of determination and optimism to this democracy, which I think is something that is desperately needed in our country today. When one of us gets elected, as I said before, it's an inspiration to others in the community, whether it's to run for office or join a campaign or make a contribution. And we absolutely, I think, 100% change the conversation. So there's that old saying that, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. But I take that a step further and say that by being at the table, we change the menu. We change the entire conversation by bringing in perspectives that weren't there. And I remember this very clearly from when I was appointed commissioner 6 months after September 11th. As the only immigrant in the room, many times I could talk from firsthand experience about what it meant to deal with New York City police, or to look at a person in uniform and not be able to distinguish whether they were New York City police or immigration services or FBI, right? And the kind of fear and confusion that invoked in our communities. And bringing that perspective to the table helped us to create policy and practice that address those fears and concerns. So let me just end by telling you a little bit about what you can do and how you can stay in touch. So I hope that I haven't depressed you. I hope that I've made you feel like, oh, there's a lot that's happening. I want to just say 3 or 4 quick things. So first of all, it's so important that you show up, that you've shown up here, and that you show up at your school board meetings and your city council meetings and the equivalent of your community board meetings. And the reason that's important, because oftentimes decisions are being made about us when we're not around. And most people are assuming that no one's paying attention. And so I encourage you to show up and take your friends, and sometimes I say take a flask if that's age appropriate, because they're not that interesting, but they are making decisions about how resources are being allocated and how we are going to be affected. I think it's important for you to think about supporting candidates, not just congressional candidates. I know that every presidential candidate is probably writing you and asking you to give them $5 so that they can get on the debate stage, but let's think about it. Do we really want them all on the debate stage? Probably not. Think about running for office. I mean, I know it doesn't pay well, but there's school board and city council, and those are not as demanding. It's a thankless job, but I tell people all the time, look, if you're doing community work, if you're a person of color, an immigrant, you're doing difficult things anyway all the time. So might as well have an elected office to do them from, where you have a little more power to decide policy. And then, of course, I hope you'll buy and read my book and write to me and tell me what you think about it. Thank you.
I think we're going to start the Q&A now, if that's
Sure.
okay.
Yeah.
Great. If you can all stand when you're selected and give us your name, your Rutgers affiliation, if you are one.
I thought you were asking us all to stand first.
No, only
Which I
when
guess
selected.
you're welcome to do, too.
Only when selected. John, do you want to select whoever?
Hi there. I'm Gail Brill-Mittler, and I'm the mayor of Highland Park.
Oh, thank you.
And we are neighbors just across the river. And the opening remarks that you were giving really hit home with me. I want you to know that back in 2000, a group of us, Michal was one of them, I didn't know she was going to be here tonight, got together and decided that we wanted to make a change in our municipality. And so, oh, by the way, we were all friends through PTO. That's how we met each other. That's the Parent Teachers Organization, for those of you who don't know. And so one of our friends, which was actually a policy graduate, and so she raised her hand and said she would be the person to run for mayor. And the rest of us put a team together. I have to tell you that we were running in a primary against a well-entrenched Highland Park and Middlesex County group of Democrats. And the New Jersey Monthly actually wrote an article about us, not talking about any of us in professional terms, but they did call us the soccer moms. My children did not play soccer, just for the record. Anyway, so she won the election. We won the election together, all of us. And since I became chair of the Democratic Committee in town, and then she got the Obama administration gave her a position as an ambassador to the UN. And we had between her and me, we had two men who stepped up to be mayor.
Every day.
Okay, but they only lasted for a year or two, because I have to tell you, when I raised my hand and said, okay, I'll do this, my kids were out of school. I was at a point in my career where I was burnt out, and I had the time and was in a financial position to do this job. And so I've been mayor for 4 years. I'm running again. Just to your point, I get a stipend of $6,000 a year. My council members get $2,000. To the point of starting on local government, because maybe it's less time,
Right.
It is so much more time. My husband is always glad to tell me and all my friends that I'm putting in 50 hours a week.
There you go.
You go to the supermarket and it's a 2-hour trip. It's always in the organic vegetable aisle that I get stopped. But I love what I do. I love the job. I love my community. I wouldn't trade it for anything. But you're right. If we want younger people, if we want people who don't have to, who do depend on an income, we need to really rethink how we're paying our elected officials. Not me. I'm fine. I'm thankfully in a position where I can do this. But in order to get more people involved and able to run, we do need to reassess the financial situation.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Someone told me that they get paid $5 a month as a stipend for being on the city council, which doesn't cover gas or childcare, right? So, and then for women, I mean, it's interesting you talked about, having kids who are older. Women basically can't win. I talk to a lot of women, and it's like, well, if you're single, they want to know why you're not married. If you're married and you have children, they want to know who's going to take care of your children. I mean, it's just like, if you're underdressed, then it's like, why don't you dress up more? If you're overdressed, who do you think you are? Why are you dressed up? I mean, it's just like an endless barrage of things in addition to everything else that you described.
Are there students who have questions or comments?
Thank you. Hello, my name is Javier Perez, first-year student at Rutgers, majoring in biomedical engineering and political science. And I really found your talk very interesting. I agree with you on so many different things, but I guess what I wanted to ask specifically about was running against incumbents and the importance of that, and the kind of the divide within specifically the Democratic Party on whether that's a good idea or not. Because obviously in turmoil times like this, we're trying to have as many seats as possible, putting as many resources into having as many seats in the House, but also at the same time trying to get, as you said, more people who look like us and more progressive, and in still representing our values, even though they, might still be under the same label of the party. Still trying to find that person who actually represents us. Do you think that running against incumbents should be more of a popular decision that more young Democrats go for in the future, and trying to push new policies and putting resources and allocating those resources into trying to take positions we already have?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's up to the voters to choose who represents them. It shouldn't be decided by the person who's in office. So two things. One is that I strongly support open primaries at all levels for the reason that, you should always have to run to get voter support. You should never take it for granted. And secondly, I think in the book, many of the people who I talk about ran against Democratic incumbents because they didn't feel that particular incumbent was as progressive as we needed them to be. So sometimes you're running against someone from your own ethnicity, and it's not a question of whether the person is of color or not. I mean, the representation gap exists, and that's very real. But what's much more important is this person fighting or just keeping the seat warm? And I think the more that we have primaries, the less likely we are to see people who are just keeping their seat warm. And the last thing I'll say about that is, look, the Democratic Party a couple weeks ago decided that, or the DCCC said that they would blacklist consultants who work for candidates who challenge incumbents. Now, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, both challenge incumbents and won seats. And the party celebrated the women who got elected, even though they weren't necessarily standing behind these women when they were running against incumbents. So I think, I don't know what that message was supposed to be, because they claimed that part of it was that they were protecting these newly elected folks. But I think fundamentally, it's sending a message that we are in charge of who is in office. And that's not a democracy to me. It's certainly not the kind of democracy that I want to see for our future.
Thank you. Did you? Yeah.
My name is Ram Chalori. I'm from West Windsor, New Jersey. The one that I wanted to ask you, are you running for something now?
I'm not running for something now. I'm not.
Why not?
I think when I made the decision to start the organization, it was that was where I felt that I would have the greatest impact. I have not ruled it out. There are two things. One is this is where I feel I can have. Am I supporting anyone? Oh, great. Thank you. I will call you up for my first check. But something I encourage people to think about always is their base, right? And I feel like I'm somebody who has a very strong network, but not necessarily a strong base in my community because I spend a lot of time outside of the community. And so I do think like being involved in your PTO, showing up is really important. A lot of people, and I think this happened with a lot of Obama alum in 2017, like many of them won, but many of them didn't win because they just didn't have, you can't just be gone all the time and then like helicopter into into a district and decide to run. So I have to spend time in one place for a while before I make a decision.
Can I ask you just one more?
Sure.
I'm part of a coalition for peace action in Princeton. What do you think, how do you sell peace in a country like the US right now? Meaning, if you talk about, if you look at any of the top level people in the government of the United States, they're all for
Yeah.
some kind of a war somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an amazing question, and I don't know that I have a definitive answer, but my perspective on that is that I think that when I think about the generation of people like me or my child, that we don't have that same perspective about the role that the U.S. should be playing in both initiating and participating in wars. And so I think that some of it is just a time thing, that I think we are going to, the world order is shifting, and that my generation, and certainly the generations after me, are much less hawkish overall. But, I say that from the perspective from my own bubble. I don't know that that's the case all around the country, frankly. So I sort of soft pedal that answer because I see a shift in certain perspectives, but I don't know if that's happening everywhere or if it's just happening in the circles that I operate in. But I think I believe that within the next 10 years that we're going to hold our leaders accountable in very different ways than we did even 2 or 5 years ago. And when you think about, I'll close with saying that the reality is that many of the ideas that were being talked about in the 2016 election, things like Medicare for all and free college tuition, seemed very strange and new at that time, appealing but strange and new, and they're now a part of our lexicon. So I think I feel very optimistic. I mean, I'm also fundamentally an optimistic person. I feel very optimistic that if we keep our eyes on the prize, that we'll be able to shift away from this idea that the U.S. is supposed to both intervene and start getting into everyone's business. And also, frankly, protect the lives of our young people, the men and women that we're sending into wars and treating as if their life has no value. Thank you all.